Hello, everyone. Please do take your seats. I'm Jonathan Brent, Executive Director of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. I was not able to attend the last program dedicated to Yiddish Voices, unfortunately, because I was traveling. So it is a very special pleasure for me to do so this evening, and in particular, to welcome the Yasky family who is here this evening. Could you please stand up, if you don't mind? Harriet Yasky, after whom this series is a memorial, really, was a very cherished member of the YIVO Institute as a volunteer for many years. It's people like Harriet who help this institution to thrive, to get where we have gotten today. And I would like to say something about that work, which is so important and which has enlivened all of the discussion of YIVO and our institution over this past year, which is our 100th anniversary, which is the idea of saving Jewish culture. People think of saving Jewish culture and they think of the Paper Brigade. They think perhaps of Antanas Ulpis, the Lithuanian librarian. They think of rescuing the archives of the Bund off the streets, or of the Hebrew Actors Union from the streets and bringing them here and putting them in our archive, and that is an act. But it's only the first part of a long process of saving this culture. Somebody has to take care of it. Somebody has to put it in order. But the most important thing, ultimately, is that someone has to read it. Someone has to take it out of those boxes and read it and understand it and make it available to another generation. Because if that last part, and explain it to that generation, if that last part of this process is missing, then the rest is only a matter of historical record. And a living culture cannot survive in that way. And the work of Harriet Yasky, and all of those in our archives, and all of those connected with YIVO, and tonight, the work of Elissa Quint and Elissa Bemporad, and I'm sure I've got Elissa and Elissa wrong, so do forgive me. They are also a key part of this process of saving our culture. So I want to simply honor their work and honor the work of all those in our archives and those in our library and those who work in every capacity to make this culture available, to make it understandable, and to breathe new life into it. So thank you again to the Yasky family for your generosity, for your support, and thank you to our authors for this evening. And all of you in the audience are the last step. So I advise you, if you wish to be part of this process of saving this culture, to buy these books. Thank you. If David would come to the podium now and say some words.
Yes, very few words. On behalf of my family members, just wanted to thank you, Jonathan, and Melissa Cohn, who kind of gave us this opportunity to honor our mom, aunt, sister, and spouse a few years ago, and you've done such a marvelous job doing that. I really am so grateful to Elissa Quint and Elissa Bemporad for bringing, the first volume that came out a couple of years ago was absolutely wonderful. I look forward to reading these next two, and especially in these challenging and confusing times when everyone's trying to figure out how to be what makes a good person and a good Jew in 2025, having texts to look to and draw on is enormously valuable. I can't think of anything my mom would have, liked to have in her honor more than these volumes. So thank you very much for that.
Good evening. So my name is Elissa Quint, and I am the co-editor of Yiddish Voices with Elissa. Yes, both of Elissa Bemporad, both of our names are Elissa. And I wanted to offer some quick and heartfelt thank yous. Thank you to the Yasky family, who followed the late Harriet Yasky, YIVO friend and volunteer, to our door and adopted her intellectual curiosity and enthusiasm for what we do. We are so grateful to you for underwriting the series. And thank you to YIVO staff for your collegiality and for your help with all manner of day-to-day questions, and a special thanks to Jonathan Brent for your encouragement and support. Mazel tov to all of you as 2025 winds down on 100 years of YIVO. Even for senior scholars like myself and Elissa, who've published multiple academic volumes, this series has been a learning experience. And I thought I'd take a moment to talk about just one of the ways this is so. When we look at literature in Yiddish, Elissa and I see neglected treasure in a language few people can read, hence the series. When our partners at Bloomsbury Academic see our proposals, their chief concern is permission to publish, permission of the author or their descendants and the original publishing house. Same is true for images. As the people in this room might guess, there is often no one to ask for such permissions. Our wonderful editorial assistant, Jennifer Stern, wrote politely to Bloomsbury just the other day, explaining that she could find no trace of the 1930s Esperanto publisher, and yes, you heard that correctly, Esperanto publisher, that published an image we would like to reproduce in a future volume. To such declarations, Bloomsbury typically writes back to us, okay, we understand, please send us proof. Proof of what? That it doesn't exist, of course. And so we go about the task of collecting proof that something that isn't there. This scenario has broader implications. Many of the works in our series are orphaned texts. When we come upon them, a set of cultural and linguistic connections that might have organically carried them into the present are no longer there. Painstakingly, our contributors weave these connections anew. Some of our translators are with us tonight. I'm not sure if Jonathan Boyarin is here. Oh, thank you for coming. Who translated a collection of exquisite short stories about Hasidic life. David Fishman, who is translating a work by celebrated novelist Chaim Grade, and Glenn Dynner, who is editing a fascinating diary from YIVO's legendary collection of autobiographies. Glenn is a distinguished scholar at the University of Virginia and author of many works on Eastern European Jewish life, and he will join Elissa and Mikhl on stage later in the program. The two volumes we celebrate tonight offer the creativity of the theater on the one hand, and on the other, the destruction of the pogrom. Both were written by pioneering women who you are about to meet. We only stumbled upon this coincidence a few months ago, but both women published their work in Warsaw, and both in 1926. There's no evidence they knew each other, but in our imagination, they walked past each other one day on a Warsaw cobblestone street, the skirts of their dresses brushing one against the other, both of them deep in thought, one formulating a well-honed sentence, the other practicing her lines for a performance. With all that was done to mark the occasion of YIVO's birthday, 2025 has reminded us of the riches stored in its archival boxes since 1925. But in fact, these boxes demonstrate that every year was a banner year of Jewish creativity. So onward to 1926.
So let me tell you how and why this book came into being. Several years ago, I was working with the exceptional Cherikover archives here at YIVO, assembled by the great historian Elias Cherikover, and I was actually writing a book about anti-Semitism in Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union, and I thought that the book would focus primarily on the blood libel in this period. So I was looking for evidence in this archive. And instead of the blood libel, I found the pogroms of the Russian Civil War, 1918, 1921, a violent war between armies and forces that were vying to control the territory of the Tsarist Empire, and a war that engulfed in horrific violence the Jewish communities of the former Pale of Settlement, Ukraine in particular. Here in the archives, I found the words of hundreds of refugees, of survivors, of medical workers who came to the rescue or reported the experience of Jews during this unprecedented violence. The witness testimonies and materials collected by one woman in particular caught my eye, especially the accounts of the destruction of Dubova. The woman was Rokhl Faygnberg, you see her here, a Yiddish writer who at the time of the war was living in a small shtetl near Balta and who experienced the pogroms. Her small town home was destroyed. She managed to reach the city of Odessa at the risk of death. She hid among peasants in the nearby villages with her newborn son, and survived thanks to the good-hearted peasant who helped her disguise herself by giving her a holiday dress with the national colors for the journey and a little cross to put around her child's neck. Because, as Faygnberg wrote, there were signposts hanging from the telephone poles calling on people to kill all little Jewish boys because when they grow up, they will all be communists. In Odessa, Faygnberg, the Yiddish writer and refugee, began to record the experiences of others who had suffered during the Civil War. She later wrote about how she began to visit the building of the Odessa Jewish community, and I'm quoting here, so that I could hear the stories of the refugees about how entire families were buried alive, so that I would soon forget about my own trivial problems. Bring with you a notebook and pencil, added a fellow writer. Everything must be recorded. From then on, every day, we used to stop by the Kehila building and hear out the stories of the refugees of the Ukrainian Jewish Churban, destruction. There were several writers among us there. Jews would tell us their stories, and we would write them down, end quote. And this is how Rokhl Faygnberg, a writer, a refugee, became a historian as well. She worked closely with Elias Cherikover in chronicling the pogroms of the Civil War, in collecting materials that would be preserved for the future historians, but also for everyone sitting in this room today. After leaving Ukraine for Warsaw, she expanded the text on Dubova that she had originally written for Cherikover, and she published it in book form in 1926, in Yiddish, of course. the power of this harrowing account of life and death in the shtetl of Dubova is confirmed by its many translations. Shortly after it appeared in Yiddish, it was translated into French and was used as a key evidence of Ukrainian leader Petliura's responsibility in the pogroms during the 1927 Schwarzbad trial in Paris. This text was then translated into Russian, as you can see here, and appeared in 1928 in Leningrad. And finally, Faygnberg herself translated into Hebrew this text. She did it after moving to Mandate Palestine. We can assume that the memory of the pogroms resurfaced with renewed power during World War II, that the events of the Holocaust took her back to 1919. This essential account is at last available in English. And for this, I thank Cynthia Madansky and her late father, Albert, for their dedication and their labor of love that shaped this translation. I also thank Yankel Salant for his thoughtful editing of the translation. And now, I leave you with the words of Rokhl Faygnberg and the voice of the remarkable Jelena Schmulenson. Thank you.
The shtetl Dubova, Dubova in Russian, lies 18 versts from Uman. The highway into the city of Uman passes through wealthy villages and peasant settlements. At this time, Dubova is also encircled by small forests of old oaks. Surrounding it, spreading far and wide, is a wealthy settlement of flourishing Ukrainian villages. And between the fields and meadows of these villages are the well-established peasant manors of the newly rich hamlet peasants. Between village and shtetl flows the narrow Yatrany River with its deep, quiet waters that lead to the Bug River, and by its brightly washed banks, the peasant orchards and gardens bloom. Also standing at the river is the big mill, which provided the food for the Dubova Jews. They were all involved in milling. Of the 300 Jewish families, 170 traded in flour. The remainder were artisans and shopkeepers. On Thursday, the neighboring peasants all brought their grain to market. The Dubova Jews bought it, ground it at the Dubova mill, and brought it to Uman, or transported it to other cities. That is how the Jews in Dubova lived in the year 5679. 1918 to 1919, when the destruction of the Jewish communities in Ukraine began. There was a Jewish pharmacist in Dubova who was ashamed of his Jewishness, similar to the Jews during the old Russian Jewish Haskalah period. He and his wife came from wealthy, intellectual Uman families. They did not at all want to engage with the Jewish community of Dubova. They were only friends with Christians. In short, he was a pharmacist who hated Jews and associated with anti-Semites. Also, there was Nistrovsky the lawyer, who publicly desecrated the Shabbos, had a pig-trafe kitchen in his Gentile-like house, and who naturally seldom gave even a kopa groschen toward Jewish community activities and Jewish needs. The rabbi of the shtetl was from the old world. He, the elderly Reb Moshe Aaron Berdichevsky, who was blessed to have as a son Mikhl Yosef, was a simple man. The Dubova Jews were great merchants. They knew what money signified, but the rabbi of the Jewish community was a modest man and would barely recognize a coin if he saw one. The Dubova rabbi had a family, and when he was young, he had small children that needed to be fed. In time, the sons were old enough to be conscripted, and the daughters to be married. But of all these matters having to do with money, only the Rebbitzin had an inkling. The community parceled out yeast for her to sell, and thereby she managed from Shabbos to Shabbos. Many years ago, there was a good Gentile, a katzap, who leased out the mill. He couldn't bear to see the suffering of the Rebbetzin, who every Thursday went on with a sack borrowing a pud of flour. So he came up with the idea of forcing the Jewish flour merchants to give the righteous good rabbi a pound of flour from every sack. And from that time on, it became an enforced duty. After the good Russian was gone, even though a few of the Jewish millers came and went, this tradition of giving a pound of flour to the rabbi remained forever. After the fire, when they reconstructed the steam mill and the flour trade in Dubova grew, the Rebbetzin became so rich with the pounds of flour that she started baking challahs for Shabbos for all the widows and orphans of the shtetl. But the rabbi was unaware of all of this. He was not interested in material matters day and night. He only sat and he studied, and if God sent him a good deed to do, he thanked him for his grace and completed it in full. That's how he healed the Jewish community from malaria many years ago. There was no doctor in the shtetl, and the Jews of the Dubova were very poor then, so their rabbi traveled to Uman and there collected a bit of money. With the money, he bought quinine and a scale, like those used in a pharmacy. And at home, the entire family, the Rebbetzin and the children, including the young Mikhl Yosef, got involved. Everyone made medicine. Afterward, the rabbi himself went house to house every day and gave everyone the remedy. And this is how the shtetl was healed. The rabbi did not interfere in community affairs. He detested conflicts, legal proceedings, and divorces. Overall, he was very unhappy when he was torn away from studying. This is what he was like for the entire 50 years that he was the rabbi in Dubova. The narrow Dubova streets had their own active Jewish community worker. He was the wheelwright Moshe Schwarzman. He had a wheel workshop and worked very hard to sustain his family, but he always had time for shtetl matters. Every community issue affected him personally, and he voiced his opinion at the community table at which the clever Dubova householders and learned people sat. But he always spoke to the point, and so people had to hear him out. He portrayed the toiling Jews of Dubova, using himself as an example. These particular people were rarely noticed in the old regime. They feared the impertinence and the loudness of the toiling Jews, but Moshe the wheelwright, who was outspoken and involved in everything, was nonetheless embraced by the community leaders. Even though he was from the boorish shoemaker street, he was a respectable person. He had refined thoughts, he could speak with anyone, and he understood each issue very well, and the Dubova elite had given him a position on the former town council. He was also very much loved by the peasant population of the surrounding villages. For them, Moshe the wheelwright was their equal. For the entire surrounding area, he made wheels for the peasants' wagons, and standing at his workbench, he would chat pleasantly with every peasant, have a drink of vodka together, and wish each other well. Moreover, he was a poor man, always worried about how he would provide his 7 small children with clothes and shoes. But the only bourgeois luxury Moshe the wheelwright did not begrudge himself was that of giving an education to his beloved son Hananiah. The first pogrom. All of them were local Gentiles. They were all wearing their coats inside out and their visors of their hats turned backwards. Those were the symbols of the overturned order in the country. Many of them painted their faces so they would not be recognized. But the Dubova Jews recognized everybody, from the feldsher to the former mailman Karczynski, to the most insignificant peasant child who ran after them like an enraged dog. They were all recognized by Jews. They killed all their victims with cold steel, and for their amusement, they fired gunshots into the desolate streets. That night, 13 people perished by all sorts of violent deaths. It was mainly the Jewish families who had conflicts with the local peasants who suffered. Kozakov's Great Massacre. This time, Kozakov burst into town with a large band of about 3,000 men. Before summer, when he had pillaged and murdered in the towns of the Uman region, many peasant youths from the surrounding villages had joined him. They were mainly armed horsemen. Their naked swords gleamed like mirrors against the sun. And this time they also carried high above their heads red and Ukrainian flags. Music played. The residents of the non-Jewish neighborhood rejoiced at the guests, and the murdering began immediately. It was the day after Tisha B'Av in 1919. The massacre lasted for 3 days. The whole town was put to death. For those 3 days, there was a celebration in the non-Jewish neighborhood. In the houses, the tables were set day and night. The young people played on accordions and danced with the bandits in the streets. Everyone ate and drank their fill together with their wives and children. The property of the Jewish town was brought to the non-Jewish neighborhood. A festive mood prevailed in the peasant courtyards of Dubova, but they were already more than satiated. On the third day of the massacre, the peasants rang the bells in the church for everyone to gather in the market for a meeting. The peasants assembled next to the church and demanded of Kozakov that he stop slaughtering women and children. Kozakov acquiesced. For the Jewish women and children, there was a hiding place at the home of the shoemaker, Dmytro Shabolinsky, and the men were killed, still killed, with all sorts of violent deaths and thrown into the clay. After the Great Massacre, there remained only 110 widows and orphans, and 32 men who had hidden with honorable good Gentiles in the surrounding villages. Dubova's 4 Jewish blacksmiths also remained alive. For all 3 days of the massacre, they hammered horseshoes for bandits, and they sharpened their swords. The blacksmiths were the only Jewish witnesses to all the violent deaths by which the Jews were killed. The clay in Dubova were pits behind the hill where the peasants used to dispose of the carcasses of their horses and cattle. There, the ground is marshy and everything sinks into the depths. The Jews of Dubova also sank without a trace after Kozakov's Great Massacre. The peasants did not allow them to be taken out of there and to be given a Jewish burial. The Great Massacre lasted 3 days and 3 nights, the 10th, 11th, and 12th of Av, 1919. After the massacre, the peasants adopted a resolution in the district that all Jews should leave Dubova. They only made an exception for the blacksmiths. The blacksmiths with their families were allowed to remain, but the widows and orphans, they yearned to escape from the devastated town anyway. However, the way to Uman was still dangerous. Several times they tried to go and they had to turn back. All around, bandits were running wild. The widows and orphans had pieces of bread to eat, which the peasants used to give them out of pity. Twice, the Dubova shoemaker, Dmytro Shabolinsky, also traveled for their sake to Uman and brought a little money for them from the committees there. He, a personal friend of Kozakov, had pity on them. Really, he fell in love with the Jews. Whoever had a penny gave it to him to hide. In the end, the widows and orphans left. Whoever had money from selling their houses gave it to Dmytro for him to bring to Uman because they were scared to carry it themselves. And Dmytro Shabolinsky served the Jewish widows and orphans honorably. He brought the money to them in Uman right on time. The blacksmiths and their families did not all remain. Out of fear, they escaped to Holovanivsk. The women and children left a few days before Rosh Hashanah, and during the Jewish holidays, the Dubova peasants tore down all the Jewish houses, cleared out the area, and plowed it to make fields and gardens. They also destroyed the Jewish cemetery. They burnt the tombstones, plowed the land, and sowed it with winter wheat. They also burnt the Torah arks, the benches, and the tables from the 2 synagogues that were still standing with their shattered windows and broken doors. And that was the end of the Jewish community in Dubova.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mikhl Yashinsky, the editor and translator of the other book we're celebrating today. That is the Memoirs of Ester-Rokhl Kaminska, the Mother of Yiddish Theatre. I should just acknowledge that we've just heard a very horrific and scary and upsetting and tragic account, and just sit with that for a moment before we move on to something that's quite different and that does contain many moments of levity and humor, and just be open to that, because life is, of course, full of tears as well as laughter, and that's something Ester-Rokhl Kaminska talks about in her memoir, which she gave the title Derner und Blumen, Thorns and Flowers. So we have both thorns tonight as well as flowers. She called it Derner und Blumen, der Weg von mein Leben, Thorns and Flowers, the path of my life. This was published after she died. She died in 1925, was born in 1870, in the Warsaw daily Der Moment, the Moment. We've called it the Mother of Yiddish Theatre, but I thought you should know the original title. And that is a theme that she develops in her, just want to make note of when I'm starting. Okay. That is a theme she develops in her memoir, the highs and lows of her life, of which there were many. It wasn't an easy life as an actress in the early Yiddish theater who came from a very poor family in the shtetl. She writes at one point in the memoir, "This was the start of my long, harrowing, and thorn-ridden path, to which I sacrificed the best and bloomiest of my years, the path that delivered me so many triumphs and blissful hours, together with so many torments and limitless sorrows." That was, I think, a sort of inadvertent rhyme, but not bad to have a rhyme in an account of a woman who acted in so many plays and operettas that were full of wonderful verse and rhyme and lightness. I should also say something about how this project came to be, how this book came to be. Elissa Quint and Miriam Chaya Siegel approached me with this memoir of Ester-Rokhl Kaminska, hoping that I would translate some excerpts of it for an anthology related to texts of women on the Yiddish stage. And that was my brief, to go and read through the memoir and find some of the best bits and translate those, and it would be a part of this anthology. But I think fell too in love with Kaminska and her book and made the mistake of translating the whole thing. So then it had to become a book of its own. So I'm very thankful to both Elissas, Elissa Quint and Elissa Bemporad, for their commitment to this book and their support of it, of getting Kaminska's story finally out there. It was never published as a book until just a few years ago. It was published for the first time in Polish as a book, now in English. But it just appeared in these newspaper installments. After her death, she wrote it in the last couple years of her life, and it was published once a week for many weeks. And so in translating it involved going into those bits of newsprint and translating, and sometimes, you know, the paper degrades over time and the scans aren't the best, and sometimes it involves just deciphering what are those actual letters. But finally got it done and was very happy to spend the time with Kaminska, who was really a wonderful personage. She was, this is a postcard that was made of her various costumes and poses along the path of her career. She was very beloved. She was called Das Kind und die Mame von Jiddischen Theater, the child and the mother of Yiddish theater. How can this be? But she grew up with the Yiddish theater. The Yiddish theater was just developing as a professional, modern cultural force at the time that she began acting in it and spreading the gospel of Yiddish theater among the Städtlich. She would travel from shtetl to shtetl and perform in barns and firehouses and in the middle of the street and wherever the troupe could find some room to perform and the allowance from the government, because Yiddish theater was actually officially banned during this period. I want to read you Kadia Molodovsky. Many of you will know that name, a famed poet. She wrote an appreciation of Ester-Rokhl Kaminska in a biographical essay, and she wrote this. She did not borrow any tricks from anyone. She was real and honest on the stage, and thus did she become Ester-Rokhl Kaminska, the mother of Yiddish theater. She was an actress who descended from a poor people, and she crowned this people's poverty. In the last months of her life, in the year 1925, while suffering from illness, she traveled to perform in a shtetl in order to help with her arrival a group of actors who were poor and hungry. The Jewish assimilationists in Poland, who considered themselves Poles of Mosaic confession, were none too curious about Jewish happenings, but they were in the habit of going to see Ester-Rokhl in the Yiddish theater. She truly belonged to the whole of her people, even to those who felt themselves estranged therefrom. That was her power. That was Kadia Molodovsky's essay, part of it that she wrote in Yiddish, that I found here in the archives at YIVO. So thank you to YIVO. This was a woman who grew up in a shtetl, poor. She says her family, they were like the shul mice. They lived off of the donations of the community. Her father was a sexton in the synagogue, and they were very, very poor. At Purim, they would receive donations of charity from the community and really would live off of those donations. Ester-Rokhl had to be told not to go and buy new shoes with the money they got on Purim or a hot bagel because the family needed it for all of their needs. But in time, she became a renowned actress. She moved to Warsaw, auditioned for Goldfaden at one point, who's the father of Yiddish theater. We're developing a whole family here. And she became the mother to a family of Yiddish actors. She had both her own children and her husband, who were actors upon the Yiddish stage, but also founded a troupe. And she was there, you see her sitting in the middle with her arms around actresses, the mother of that troupe. And she was not a kayaf. She didn't suffer from kayafism, as someone writes. A kayaf is an actor who is jealous of other actors. She was not that. She was supportive and loving, and people came to her for help. She was a mame, and that's what's inscribed on her tombstone. You see here, this is her matseva, her tombstone, in the largest cemetery in Warsaw, and it says E.R. Kaminska, Mame Ester-Rokhl Kaminska, there at the bottom. Just one funny thing about that matseve, you might be able to see that there's a face of a lion in the center, but it doesn't look necessarily very leonine. It looks rather human. And there was a lot of pushback from the administrators of this Jewish cemetery in Warsaw that it looked too much like a human face and thus was a violation of the prohibition against graven images of people. So I think the sculptor Rubenlicht had to go back and make the face a little less human, a little more lion. Yeah. But she wasn't always a mame. She started off as a tochter, a kind, So now I'm going to get into the readings from her life and start with something from her childhood. And the process of translating a book is in a way embodying the person that you're translating. And that's one of the real joys of translating, finding that person's voice and while you're working on the book, in a sense, becoming them. So I'm going to become Kaminska a bit throughout these readings. And she was a mistress of the stage, so that, of course, involves some costumes. So, if you'll allow me, and even if you won't allow me, okay. All right. Kaminska as a child. I'm sure that in the big cities, even if a person lives to 100 years, they could not see and experience all the things I did just in my childhood years in that tiny shtetl of Porozove. How much sweetness surrounded me on a typical evening in summertime, when other children and I would sit in a great big circle in the courtyard with little clay bowls in our laps and wooden spoons in our hands, waiting for one of our mothers to bring out a massive bowl filled with sweet milky noodles. When she appeared, all the children would dart to her side with their utensils and remain there until she filled their bowls to the brim. Then they would slowly, carefully bring them back to their spot in the circle and, hunched over the bowls, eat up the noodles while listening to the sweet song of the Gentile boys and girls who were returning from the harvest with their scythes and sickles slung over their shoulders. The shiksas were all in vigorous good health, wearing lightweight dresses of pink, white, and blue, with kerchiefs tied around their heads, each in the arm of a shegets, joining their song with the young men's in delicious harmony. I wonder now, how did these peasants come to sing so beautifully and in multiple vocal lines, with nary a single sour note among them? Now I know that songs are classified as duets or trios or quartets, but I knew nothing of such nomenclature then. I only knew that the songs were lovely, and so was eating the noodles and milk. The singing would continue late into the night, and the echoes from the fields would resound throughout the entire shtetl. In the evenings, the singing of the peasants in the fields. In the mornings, the singing of the yeshiva bochrim, the yeshiva students in the study house. My soul was always saturated with song. Those were the first songs she heard. The yeshiva bochrim in the Beis Medrash studying, the peasants returning from the fields. Somehow these songs entered her soul, and she in time became a singer and an actress. All right. I'm going to now move on to her performance in Die Zauberin, which was her first performance on the Yiddish stage. And this is Goldfaden's The Sorceress, in which she played the role of the ingenue Mirele. And she talks about taking her first steps on stage in Die Zauberin or Die Kischefmacherin. Descending into the dressing rooms, which were located beneath the stage, we found all the actors already there getting ready. When they saw me, they rejoiced and came to congratulate me and wish me success. Soon I was led to the cosmetician. Antony was his name. He sat me down and, well, Antony began to smear my face with some kind of fat. Up until then, my face had never had anything on it besides soap and water. Then he rubbed my cheeks so and did my lips with a bit of carmine I had bought, sprinkled my face with the powder, and using a matchstick, traced a black line under my eyes. After reddening the edges of my nostrils and once again dumping powder over my entire face, he said, "Pani gotova," The lady is ready. Oh. Then she goes on and does The Sorceress, to great acclaim. Thank you. The performance ends. I return to my dressing room, and I asked aloud, how am I supposed to wash my makeup off? At which Antony, the cosmetician, came over and removed all the color by wiping my face with pork fat. I stood there rooted to the spot, my cheeks absolutely shining with grease. The actress Trilling noticed and advised me to powder up a bit. And so I threw some powder on, and then I looked altogether like a miller. Dank, Antony. Jeremy Walsh as Antony. I was well aware that the assembled actors were chuckling to themselves at my expense, but it was a drop of water in the ocean in comparison with the prevailing mood of festivity. It is simply impossible to capture what state my mind was in on that one lovely night over 30 years ago. After the performance, my fiancé escorted me home, as did Kaminski. Kaminski, of course, she would eventually marry, since he also lived on Pavia Street. This time we walked and shared with each other all our impressions of the performance, who was good and who managed to get out the German well, for in those days that was a chief concern. They had to sometimes perform in German to avoid the ban on Yiddish theater and the government censors who were sitting in the audience. After arriving home, I quickly went to bed, but try as I might, I could not fall asleep until it had grown quite late. When morning came, the household did not wake me, letting me sleep in a bit. They had gained some respect for their little artist, their artistke. And anyhow, this was Shabbos morning, and on Shabbos it's acceptable to stay in bed a little longer than usual. Around noon, the family finally barged in and asked me, so, how did all go, artistke? How much money did you earn? But answer made I none. One more reading, and here we get to the thorns of her life, because we've heard about some of the blooms, and now we get to a thorn. They're on the road. They're traveling from shtetl to shtetl, and it's hard traveling on the road in the middle of winter in an open wagon. And she's traveling with her young son, Yosef Hirsch, a baby. Such was the first journey of Yosef Hirsch, and his last. The poor soul was suffocated while nursing. It turned out that the wet nurse, having hunched over in a tightly coiled position so as to protect herself from the cold, forgot about the child at her breast and had inadvertently smothered him. Others reckoned that the child had frozen to death because on the same journey, the cheeks of the actor Rothschild's young son had been touched with frostbite. Once my troopmates noticed what had happened to my little boy, he was already dead. But no one spoke a word of it to me until we arrived at Chernigov. Earlier, I had observed that my husband was deathly pale and everyone else was trying not to meet my eye. My heart told me that some disaster had befallen us. When I asked what it was, everyone just told me about Rothschild's boy and his frozen cheeks. But little by little, I began to guess at what had taken place. Finally, one of my fellow actresses delivered the tragic news. My son, Yosef Hirsch, was buried in the Jewish cemetery of Chernigov. And on the day of his burial, I had to go and perform. We were putting on Kenig Achashverosh, King Ahasuerus. Even as my heart throbbed with grief, I went on and played Queen Esther. It was no coincidence that the next day, people all over town were raving about how the queen had performed as though she were actually undergoing some excruciating ordeal.
Fremd seien mir die Wörter gar. A zarte Hand von mein getreue Mutter hat nicht geglätt meine junge Haar. Ich hab kein Bruder, keine Schwester. Ernst bin ich wie ein Stein. Ich weiß nicht mehr, als man ruft mich Esther. Und als ich hab bei dir gefunden, It
is worth noting that when I played Queen Esther, It was like celebrating my name day, my imenini, as it is called in Russian. I was named for Queen Esther and deeply loved playing the role, which was also one of my best. Thank you, Yelena. There's Ester-Rokhl, our beautiful Ester-Rokhl. A photo also here from the YIVO archives. Here she is towards the end of her life. She died from cancer eventually at the age of 55. And I like this picture because it shows her with what I think is a pen in her hand. And it's like she's setting down her memoirs in these final years. Just wanted to end with this same image that I began with. This is her application to the Yiddish Actors Union in Warsaw, together with the photograph that was clipped to that, held here at the YIVO archives. And you can see even in the corner of the photograph is the emblem of the union. And this photo became the cover of the book. So it's this photo that was in that application, still with the emblem of the union in the corner. And I thought I would go and take a picture of it near my home in Brooklyn among the roses to commemorate Dernner und Blumen, thorns and flowers along the path of my life. So yeah, get a book and put a rose in it. And thank you. Now we have a discussion. No, I'm good. Thank you. Go back to Mikhl.
Okay, I'm glad we had the reenactment of that one and not the other one. It's interesting. You know, I want to just talk about how, first of all, my experience as a reader, just feeling like, oh my gosh, how could this never have been translated before? These are two minor classics. They just plunge you into this world, this lost world, in a way that's, it's not tainted by nostalgia, by politicization. It just feels natural, really authentic. Yet you couldn't have two more different works. One is really commemorating the death of a shtetl, Jewish death and destruction. The other really commemorating life and creativity and this life force, this vitality. But what I think they have in common, if I were to bridge the two, is rose and thorns is a beautiful analogy. But what I would emphasize is a few things. First of all, from each of these works, you really get the sense of vulnerability. This ephemeral quality of Jewish life in Eastern Europe that's fragile, and at the same time, it's so bold and courageous. There's this incredible kind of resilient sort of urge, need, desire for self-expression. And even life itself is self-expression. But what really struck me with each of these is, I guess we'd call it a chutzpah, because you're in a position of extreme vulnerability. I had no idea that Yiddish theater was that vulnerable. And I'm going to turn to you first, Mikhl, for a question. Maybe on a slightly lighter note, but not so light. It's never so light. To set off in a theater troupe and to perform in Yiddish, we normally think of something like Yiddish theater as nostalgic, maybe even melodramatic, something that is perhaps canonized in Fiddler on the Roof and other, but even like other Yiddish theater performances today, it's something you look back upon fondly, and yet this is just so transgressive. I really was struck by the way that it was a double transgression. Because on the one hand, Oi Gewalt, my daughter's becoming an actress, and this is shaming the family. It's an infraction, it's a transgression of traditional Jewish piety on the one hand. So internally, it's transgressive. But then you have the problem of not being allowed to perform in Yiddish, that's a major transgression, that it's even criminal, and you're chased out of town. Some beautiful passages there where the performance is going on, supposed to be in German, they slip into Yiddish, and then, oh my gosh, the governor's in the audience, or the censor's in the audience. We have to switch back to German, but it's too late, and we get banned and thrown out of the town. And you see, it's just life on a knife's edge. And suddenly Yiddish theater looks so different. So I was wondering if you could speak to that kind of transgressive quality of Yiddish theater.
Yeah, I think it's exactly as you said. They sort of got it from all sides, these early Yiddish actors. They were eventually beloved, but they had to work to become beloved. And this story tells the story of that journey of traveling among the shtetlich and letting them know what theater is and performing for them. Theater they would have seen for the first time, many of these Jews. But also facing resistance from those people. Sometimes people turning up their noses at them, calling them komediantchikes, two-bit comedians, kunstenmachers even, magicians, trick makers. And her family certainly felt this way. She had to very much rebel against her family, who were pious, and she was raised as a pious Jewish daughter. And word got back to her family after she had moved to Warsaw that she had started acting on the Yiddish stage, and she received a letter from home saying, please give up this career or you'll literally kill your elderly parents. And she says that it was the death of her parents ultimately that gave her the sort of emotional allowance to go and perform, which she really started doing in earnest only after they died. And of course from the government. This was a time Yiddish theater was banned, and they had all kinds of kunst and all kinds of tricks to get up on the stage and do their thing. Sometimes it was getting the censor drunk. They found out that the censor liked vodka, and so they would take him to the tavern before the performance and get him drunk, so he wouldn't notice if they slipped into Yiddish. Or they would send the women on before, and so they could, in a way, charm the censors and the governors. So there's a lot there about the role of women and exploitation, to some extent, of women. There are some really kind of dangerous moments there involving that, but this was a dangerous life and a transgressive life, as you say. So these people were very brave and pioneers. Yeah.
Did you? Yeah.
Can I jump in? I just thought of a connection between these two women. And since we're thinking about transgression, Rokhl Faygnberg was also born in a small shtetl, Lubian, in Belarus, what is today Belarus, and in the Minsk gubernian. She also came from a very pious family, very poor family. And what is so interesting is that writing in Yiddish was an act of transgression, right? At 13, she wrote, she tried out, right? Writing, becoming a writer in Yiddish, and she wrote a novel, Joseph und Rose, Joseph and Rose, and the family was so enraged that, there was this whole scandal, and in the end, she burned the manuscript. She burned it because this was an act of transgression, right? Becoming a writer. So it's not only becoming an actor. So I was just thinking of this kind of connection between these two women.
Can you also expand on that? Because she's also a pioneer, arguably a pioneer of the Yizkor book, which is a memorial book. Why would you write a recent history of a shtetl that's practically been erased, and not just focus on the pious heroes, the martyrs, the rabbi himself. There's a beautiful, poignant, tragic episode of the death of the rabbi, to be sure, but it's no more or less than the tragic deaths of ordinary people as well, women and men. This seems to be new. Could you speak to this kind of invention of a genre that's happening here?
Yeah, so, and to talk about that, actually, I want to go back to the first version of this text, which is from the YIVO archive, the Cherikover archive, that she wrote for Cherikover himself. You can see the date, maybe 1922. Cherikover is already in Berlin. She collected these witness accounts from survivors from Dubova and Uman, who were in Odessa, and she, she spoke to them for hours and hours, and she collected all the information. What is so interesting is that in this first version, this is not a Yiskerbuch, because it's really, it's a community record of death, a Pinkes or Pinkas von a Teuter Stadt, right? It still is a community record, but the focus is on death. The list of those who were killed, their age, their profession, how they were killed, how they were tortured. If it was the first pogrom, the second pogrom, the third pogrom. It's about death. It becomes a Yiskerbuch when she expands on it, and she brings in all the stories, the texture of everyday life that Yelena read so beautifully about the life of the shtetl, right? It's still a Pinkes, a community record, but the focus is also on the life that preceded the destruction, the oblivion. So it is, I think it foreshadows the Yiskerbücher that were so painstakingly, put together by survivors to remember their Städtlach, their towns, after the Holocaust, because there is an emphasis also on daily life, the texture of everyday life. Whether it was Nistrovsky who, in the end converts, he attempts to, save his life by converting, he is killed anyway, or if it was the rabbi. But there is an emphasis on life, and I think she was also aware of the fact that the excision of this community would acquire a different meaning if it was put in conversation with the life that preceded.
And I would emphasize also
destruction.
people, these really detailed, intimate character portraits, like Moshe the Wheelmaker, for example, who shows so much courage. He's well loved by the locals, including local non-Jews, which is extraordinary. He has a showdown at the very end where, he really, they actually beg him to stay in the shtetl. The non-Jewish some of them former pogromists actually ask him to stay, and he speaks very courageously against future massacres. That your children's blood will answer for the blood of our children. It says, there's just these extraordinary moments of people, and if you're going to think about a strategy for writing about this thing, I would call it microcosm. Because the town itself becomes a microcosm, but then you have these individual characters who also become microcosms. And somehow it's bearable. I don't know if anybody wants to spend their Sunday afternoon reading about, this horrific destruction of a shtetl. I promise you that it was done in such a way that she has this genius for making you care about these people. Even as they're dying, she resisted dehumanization. That was, of course, the whole point. And that may be the greatest achievement here.
One of the greatest achievements, actually, is the way in which she humanizes the victims. And she humanizes their the choiceless choices they make. And May I read from, actually, apropos this point that you raised, Glenn, the way in which she humanizes the victims and really recreates in real time their fears, their despair, their vulnerability, and their powerlessness. Everything was packed up. Everything was ready for flight. There was an air of desolation. At night, they slept in their clothes. All their relatives and friends gathered under one roof, and the day frightened them with pain and misery. A depression fell upon them. The news from everywhere made them insane. There was nowhere to run. And, you know, it's very powerful how she humanizes the victims, and I think that this is one of the reasons why this microcosm of violence is so powerful. Yeah.
So if I could turn to you, Mikhl. So one of the things that really struck me, and perhaps in a strange way, this might be related, is the strangeness of the repertoire of Yiddish theater. So now we're shifting to expressions of Jewish life. Why on earth some of these choices of plays to put on, like Babi Yachna, the sorceress, or what is it, Der Trefnak, the heretic? Can you make any rhyme or reason out of this? There are only about 4 plays, if I'm correct, that they would put on again and again, so they must be expressing something really deep and really integral to this experience.
Well, yeah, Goldfaden in this period that's covered by the memoir was really the stock and trade of this troupe. And shout out to Elissa Quint's book, The Rise of the Modern Yiddish Theatre, which is all about Goldfaden and his creation, really, of this genre. Goldfaden was beloved. They were these wonderful, lively song and dance operettas drawing from Jewish history and Jewish types, so that when people saw this stuff, they saw themselves, and but with a twist, with a knetch, and a lot of fun to be had at the expense of, well, one type that gets repeated over and over in a lot of these is the chnyok, or the very studious, very orthodox young man that the young, enlightened girl doesn't want to marry. She wants to marry a maskil, someone who's more into the Enlightenment. So you see themes in modern Jewish life playing out. And yeah, a lot of fun. I mean, the Kishefmacherin, the sorceress, which was her first performance on stage, she was the ingenue Mirele. The Kishefmacherin herself, the witch, is always played by a man. I played that role with the Volksbühne a few years ago. But I think it's telling that in her 30-year anniversary of her career, she was feted. She was, by that point, a veteran of the Yiddish stage, celebrated, the mother of Yiddish theater. And what did she choose to perform? She was at that point, I don't know, 50 or something, 50 I'd say. Mirele, the 16-year-old girl, the ingenue of the sorceress. That's what she did for her big 30-year anniversary. So it wasn't a terribly august affair. She wanted to play in this fairy tale as a young girl. And that's kind of what, the inspiration from that is kind of what made me want to do some drag tonight, because I thought, at this very important occasion, she went on and played this silly thing that people loved. So I wanted to have a bit of this at our august occasion tonight, yeah.
So I want to ask a very serious and difficult question of Elissa, and that is the portrayals of sexual violence. It's something I think it's been avoided a lot in the historical literature until recently, with Irina Ashkevich's book, and then your own work, and wondering what you think of the way that sexual violence is portrayed, and I think we need to emphasize up front there's a reason why you don't talk about this, right? Because it might bring shame on the family. You're doubling the victimization in a sense, and yet she really does address it.
She addresses it in a very nuanced way. I think, first of all, she spent a lot of time with, the survivors. She does not want to, mention names, of course. And, when we think about sexual violence, rape, there's the question of taboo, there's the question of, if it's a young woman, the value of the woman for the, for the marriage market decreases significantly. But she does mention it, she gives innuendos. So for the reader, it is very clear, what is happening. The question has been avoided in scholarship, yes, until the work of Irina Stashkiewicz, which is a very important work, the work that I've done. It has been avoided precisely for this reason. I mean, it's very hard to have data, hard data. It is hard, to find, witness accounts that mention the violence that was extremely widespread, according to a scholar in France, Thomas Chopard. It was 1 out of 10 Jewish women and girls were raped. And so one of the reasons why I was drawn to this text was the fact that she does discuss rape. She does bring sexual violence into she includes this in the experience of the victims, but she respects the victims as well. I could say much more about this. I mean, the violence becomes more public. It becomes ritualized by the second or the third pogrom. And she captures, it's very powerful how she captures, again, without addressing it, without naming it very often, but she still discusses the everydayness of rape. The sounds of rape, the colors of rape, based on these witness accounts. And she does it almost in passing. So for example, I'll just read this quote, this very powerful. "This is how the day passed. The heat was great, and in the surrounding sunny golden fields, they were cutting the ripe grain, and along with this, the screaming of those being raped and tortured to death split the bright blue skies." So it's almost as if she's acknowledging, again, the everydayness of rape, or the normalcy of this aspect of the dehumanization and violence.
Okay. Should we open it up, to questions? Okay. And you don't have to have had read the book.
Yes.
The books.
Alex is in charge.
I read half the book, and what I found most surprising to me, there was a mention of, because all of this is happening as Ukraine is trying to become independent. So there are the Ukrainians who are trying to, make it a separate, tear away from Russia, and there's a lot of agitation for independent Ukraine by a young intellectual elite, and then this pogrom happens, and there's this, there's a whole, 2 pages of that the young Ukrainian intellectuals were stunned that that their agitation for Ukraine, for independence of Ukraine, resulted in the death of these bystanders who had nothing to do with it. And I've never seen it in any book anywhere before, because we all have thoughts of, Ukrainians, anti-Semitic, Jews, poor suffering victims, but there was this whole, they were just not prepared for what their words were going to bring forth. This is not a question. As
No,
always,
that's
and
a wonderful
apologize, but
that's
I've
a
never
wonderful
seen it in any book
comment, and
before.
it's one of the reasons why I was very drawn to this text. And by the way, this is this excerpt that you mentioned is censored from the Russian version. You should read the Russian version, which of course is. The Soviet Union, 1928, is instrumentalizing very much this text, weaponizing it, because it wants to discredit, in all ways possible, Ukrainian nationalism. But that's precisely what you said, one of the reasons why I was drawn to this text.
Just a very brief memory, which, Mikhl, you have brought to mind something I haven't thought about for decades. In 1968, I think, my mother schlepped me from New Jersey to see Ida Kaminska perform Mirala Efros in Midtown. And of course, it was in Yiddish, and I was so mortified that I didn't understand the play in the original and had to wear these very awkward simultaneous translation headphones that in retrospect, I think it was one of my primary motivations for eventually learning Yiddish.
Ida Kaminska, the daughter of Ester-Rokhl Kaminska, was a great actress and a star in her own right. She actually brought Yiddish theater, I think, in that year to Broadway, was doing Mirala Efros and Brecht, it translated into Yiddish. And Ida Kaminska's first time on stage was playing in Mirala Efros as the grandson of Mirala Efros, as she was like 5 years old, and she was playing Mirala's grandson, while her mother, Ester-Rokhl, was playing Mirala. So it's a real dynasty, yeah. And a lot of drag. Yeah.
Hi, this is a question for Elissa. Can you tell us a little bit about your process as an editor of a historical text that has been translated several times into several different languages? What was it that you were looking for to leave in, take out? Tell us a little bit about your process of making this now a contemporary book.
Okay, thank you for the question, and I should include, the translators, Cynthia, who's here, Madansky, and Albert Oliva Sholem, unfortunately, is not here. Janko Salant also helped with editing, but the text is the text that she, the book. It's not this shorter version, but it's the book that was published in 1926, and translated word by word. Nothing was cut, nothing was, really edited from the text, removed from the text. Actually, in some, right, Cynthia, I'm also, in some cases it is repetitive in a few cases. We could have edited it out, but because it is a historical document, especially because it was used as key evidence for the Schwarzbard trial of 1927, I did not explain what it was because we had a very, we didn't have enough time, but Sholem Schwarzbard in 1926 assassinates in downtown Paris Shimon Petliura in retaliation for the pogroms. He blames Petliura for the pogroms. After all, about 10 members of his family suffered during the pogroms. So he kills him, and then there's a trial against him. And there is a Schwarzbad Defense Committee. Cherikover is a member, the historian Elias Cherikover is a member of the committee, and he wants this text to be used as evidence. So this text is a historical text, we could not. But maybe, Cynthia, you want to add something?
Rewriting of the story. So we compared the Yiddish text to the Hebrew text and tried to understand what she was speaking about in the Hebrew text and why she changed it, in a sense. But it was very much word-to-word translation.
Mikhl, you mentioned that Kaminska wrote this originally to be posted as a recurring story in the newspaper. I'm curious what it was like to adapt that into what ended up being more of a novel format. Did you feel like you were adjusting the language and the tone of things to flow together into a novel, or was it already constructed that way in the periodical?
She already had chapters that I used as my chapter divisions. Sometimes even in one installment in the weekly newspaper, there would be 2 chapters. So it was already pretty much written as chapters of a book. It just so happened to be published not as a book, but as installments in a newspaper. The process of it being published in the newspaper was interesting. We have actually her letters that she exchanged with Ab Kahan, the editor of the Forwards, who was very interested in the material. She sent him a few chapters while she was still living, of course. And he said, "This is great, but your public wants to hear about all of your time on the stage in your most famous productions, you know, when you were already an established actress, when you were a star. So start with that, and then eventually we can get to your childhood." And like you said, it was a defiant thing to be a woman author, and they had male editors breathing down their necks, telling them how they should write, what they should do, and she defied him. She continued writing her story as she wanted to write it, and it, zu gesund. And it ended up being, the result is that this book doesn't actually cover her whole life, because she died before she could complete it, before she really got to the years of her greatest stardom. But we have a wonderful chronicle of the early, to me, kind of most exciting years of Yiddish theater, when it wasn't really established, when it was dangerous, and of her childhood in the shtetl with all of its folkways. So that's a story worth telling. And in order to tell that story, she had to not listen to men.
Do you want to take one last question? Or?
This will be a good follow-up to this. But Mikhl, as you've been translating Ester-Rokhl and also looking into this historic Yiddish theater, and I think especially piggybacking off that last thing you said about this is when it was sort of dangerous and as it's developing, how has that influenced you as you've been writing new Yiddish theater?
Well, it's a good question, Chave. Yes, I also write new Yiddish plays. I think I am inspired by people like that, pioneers who were really creating an art form. And I think today, in a way, it has to be recreated in a way. What people are doing now, we don't have that same connection to the past that people grew up in the shtetl did. But we can be inspired by them. And of course, I'm inspired by reading their works and, yeah, developing my own Yiddish through reading and sort of incorporating their Yiddish is very powerful and important. And yeah, I mean, I was translating this while I was performing in Yiddish theater, in the Kishif Macharin, in the Sorceress, and the Fiddler on the Roof. And I literally would go off stage as the witch and with my big fake plastic nails clack out a few paragraphs of Kaminska and then go back on stage while she was telling the story of performing in that same operetta. So that was a very heady experience.
I just want to end with just an observation about both these works. You know, this is an age of ideology, the early 20th century, where you could join one club or another and feel like you knew all the answers. These are two works of great courage because they're works of real vulnerability. To be vulnerable in the early 20th century is something extraordinary. I just want to point that out just as an observation, and maybe to be vulnerable as a writer today is also an act of real courage. Something to think about. Congratulations to our authors, our translators.
We have both books for sale in the hall, and we also have some light refreshments. So please, let's continue this conversation out there. Thank you again to everyone who made tonight's program possible.
Thank you very much. Thank you.